Chapter 15 of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 15. Isabel looked down at the letter in her hand, considered it in silence, and turned to Moody. "I feel tempted to open it already," she said. "After giving your promise?" Moody gently remonstrated. Isabel met that objection with a woman's logic. "Does a promise matter," she asked, "when one gives it to a dirty, disreputable, presuming old wretch like Mr. Sharon? It's a wonder to me that you trust such a creature. I wouldn't." "I doubted him just as you do," Moody answered, "when I first saw him in company with Mr. Troy. But there was something in the advice he gave us at that first consultation which altered my opinion of him for the better. I dislike his appearance and manners as much as you do. I may even say I felt ashamed of bringing such a person to see you. And yet I can't think that I have acted unwisely in employing Mr. Sharon." Isabel listened absently. She had something more to say, and she was considering how she should say it. "May I ask you a bold question?" she began. "Any question you like." "Have you—" She hesitated and looked embarrassed. "Have you paid Mr. Sharon much money?" she resumed, suddenly rallying her courage. Instead of answering, Moody suggested that it was time to think of returning to Miss Pink's villa. "Your aunt may be getting anxious about you," he said. Isabel led the way out of the farmhouse in silence. She reverted to Mr. Sharon and the money, however, as they returned by the path across the fields. "I am sure you will not be offended with me," she said gently, "if I own that I am uneasy about the expense. I am allowing you to use your purse as if it was mine, and I have hardly any savings of my own." Moody entreated her not to speak of it. "How can I put my money to a better use than in serving your interests?" he asked. "My one object in life is to relieve you of your present anxieties. I shall be the happiest man living if you only owe a moment's happiness to my exertions." Isabel took his hand and looked at him with grateful tears in her eyes. "How good you are to me, Mr. Moody," she said. "I wish I could tell you how deeply I feel your kindness." "You can do it easily," he answered with a smile. "Call me Robert. Don't call me Mr. Moody." She took his arm with a sudden familiarity that charmed him. "If you had been my brother I should have called you Robert," she said. "And no brother could have been more devoted to me than you are." He looked eagerly at her bright face turned up to his. "May I never hope to be something nearer and dearer to you than a brother?" he asked timidly. She hung her head and said nothing. Moody's memory recalled Sharon's coarse reference to her sweetheart. She had blushed when he put the question? What had she done when Moody put his question? Her face answered for her. She had turned pale. She was looking more serious than usual. Ignorant as he was of the ways of women, his instinct told him that this was a bad sign. Surely her rising color would have confessed it, if time and gratitude together were teaching her to love him? He sighed as the inevitable conclusion forced itself on his mind. "I hope I have not offended you," he said sadly. "Oh, no." "I wish I had not spoken. Pray don't think that I am serving you with any selfish motive." "I don't think that, Robert. I never could think it of you." He was not quite satisfied yet. "Even if you were to marry some other man," he went on earnestly, "it would make no difference in what I am trying to do for you. No matter what I might suffer, I should still go on, for your sake." "Why do you talk so?" she burst out passionately. "No other man has such a claim as you to my gratitude and regard. How can you let such thoughts come to you? I have done nothing in secret. I have no friends who are not known to you. Be satisfied with that, Robert, and let us drop the subject." "Never to take it up again?" he asked, with the infatuated pertinacity of a man clinging to his last hope. At other times, and under other circumstances, Isabel might have answered him sharply. She spoke with perfect gentleness now. "Not for the present," she said. "I don't know my own heart. Give me time." His gratitude caught at those words, as the drowning man is said to catch at the proverbial straw. He lifted her hand, and suddenly and fondly pressed his lips on it. She showed no confusion. Was she sorry for him, poor wretch? And was that all? They walked on, arm in arm, in silence. Crossing the last field, they entered again on the high road leading to the row of villas in which Miss Pink lived. The minds of both were preoccupied. Neither of them noticed a gentleman approaching on horseback, followed by a mounted groom. He was advancing slowly, at the walking pace of his horse, and he only observed the two foot passengers when he was close to them. "Miss Isabel!" She started, looked up, and discovered Alfred Hardyman. He was dressed in a perfectly made traveling suit of light brown, with a peaked felt hat of a darker shade of the same color, which, in a picturesque sense, greatly improved his personal appearance. His pleasure at discovering Isabel gave the animation to his features which they wanted on ordinary occasions. He sat his horse, a superb hunter, easily and gracefully. His light amber-colored gloves fitted him perfectly. His obedient servant, on another magnificent horse, waited behind him. He looked the impersonation of rank and breeding, of wealth and prosperity. What a contrast, in a woman's eyes, to the shy, pale, melancholy man in the ill-fitting black clothes, with the wandering, uneasy glances, who stood beneath him, and felt, and showed that he felt, his inferior position keenly. In spite of herself, the treacherous blush flew over Isabel's face in Moody's presence, and with Moody's eyes distrustfully watching her. "This is a piece of good fortune that I hardly hoped for," said Hardyman, his cool, quiet, dreary way of speaking quickened as usual in Isabel's presence. "I only got back from France this morning, and I called on Lady Lydiard in the hope of seeing you. She was not at home, and you were in the country, and the servants didn't know the address. I could get nothing out of them, except that you were on a visit to a relation." He looked at Moody while he was speaking. "Haven't I seen you before?" he said carelessly. "Yes, at Lady Lydiard's. You're her steward, are you not? How do you do?" Moody, with his eyes on the ground, answered silently by a bow. Hardyman, perfectly indifferent whether Lady Lydiard's steward spoke or not, turned on his saddle and looked admiringly at Isabel. "I begin to think I am a lucky man at last," he went on with a smile. "I was jogging along to my farm, and despairing of ever seeing Miss Isabel again, and Miss Isabel herself meets me at the roadside. I wonder whether you are as glad to see me as I am to see you? You won't tell me, eh? May I ask you something else? Are you staying in our neighborhood?" There was no alternative before Isabel but to answer this last question. Hardyman had met her out walking, and had no doubt drawn the inevitable inference, although he was too polite to say so in plain words. "Yes, sir," she answered shyly. "I am staying in this neighborhood." "And who is your relation?" Hardyman proceeded in his easy matter-of-course way. "Lady Lydiard told me, when I had the pleasure of meeting you at her house, that you had an aunt living in the country. I have a good memory, Miss Isabel, for anything that I hear about you. It's your aunt, isn't it? Yes, I know everybody about here. What is your aunt's name?" Isabel, still resting her hand on Robert's arm, felt it tremble a little as Hardyman made this last inquiry. If she had been speaking to one of her equals, she would have known how to dispose of the question without directly answering it. But what could she say to the magnificent gentleman on the stately horse? He had only to send his servant into the village to ask who the young lady from London was staying with, and the answer, in a dozen mouths at least, would direct him to her aunt. She cast one appealing look at Moody, and pronounced the distinguished name of Miss Pink. "Miss Pink?" Hardyman repeated. "Surely I know Miss Pink." He had not the faintest remembrances of her. "Where did I meet her last?" He ran over in his memory the different local festivals at which strangers had been introduced to him. "Was it at the archery meeting, or at the grammar school when the prizes were given? No, it must have been at the flower show, then, surely." It had been at the flower show. Isabel had heard it from Miss Pink 50 times at least, and was obliged to admit it now. "I am quite ashamed of never having called," Hardyman proceeded. "The fact is, I have so much to do. I am a bad one at paying visits. Are you on your way home? Let me follow you and make my apologies personally to Miss Pink." Moody looked at Isabel. It was only a momentary glance, but she perfectly understood it. "I am afraid, sir, my aunt cannot have the honor of seeing you today," she said. Hardyman was all compliance. He smiled and patted his horse's neck. "Tomorrow, then," he said. "My compliments, and I will call in the afternoon. Let me see, Miss Pink lives at—" He waited, as if he expected Isabel to assist his treacherous memory once more. She hesitated again. Hardyman looked round at his groom. The groom could find out the address, even if he did not happen to know it already. Besides, there was the little row of houses visible at the further end of the road. Isabel pointed to the villas as a necessary concession to good manners, before the groom could anticipate her. "My aunt lives there, sir, at the house called the Lawn." "Ah, to be sure," said Hardyman. "I oughtn't to have wanted reminding, but I have so many things to think of at the farm. And I am afraid I must be getting old. My memory isn't as good as it was. I am so glad to have seen you, Miss Isabel. You and your aunt must come and look at my horses. Do you like horses? Are you fond of riding? I have a quiet roan mare that is used to carrying ladies. She would be just the thing for you. Did I beg you to give my best compliments to your aunt? Yes? How well you are looking! Our air here agrees with you. I hope I haven't kept you standing too long. I didn't think of it in the pleasure of meeting you. Good bye, Miss Isabel. Good bye till tomorrow." He took off his hat to Isabel, nodded to Moody, and pursued his way to the farm. Isabel looked at her companion. His eyes were still on the ground. Pale, silent, motionless, he waited by her like a dog, until she gave the signal of walking on again towards the house. "You are not angry with me for speaking to Mr. Hardyman?" she asked, anxiously. He lifted his head to the sound of her voice. "Angry with you, my dear? Why should I be angry?" "You seem so changed, Robert, since we met Mr. Hardyman. I couldn't help speaking to him, could I?" "Certainly not." They moved on towards the villa. Isabel was still uneasy. There was something in Moody's silent submission to all that she said and all that she did which pained and humiliated her. "You're not jealous?" she said, smiling timidly. He tried to speak lightly on his side. "I have no time to be jealous while I have your affairs to look after," he answered. She pressed his arm tenderly. "Never fear, Robert, that new friends will make me forget the best and dearest friend who is now at my side." She paused and looked up at him with a compassionate fondness that was very pretty to see. "I can keep out of the way tomorrow when Mr. Hardyman calls," she said. "It is my aunt he's coming to see, not me." It was generously meant, but while her mind was only occupied with the present time, Moody's mind was looking into the future. He was learning the hard lesson of self sacrifice already. Do what you think is right, he said quietly. Don't think of me. They reached the gate of the villa. He held out his hand to say good-bye. Won't you come in? She asked. Do come in. Not now, my dear. I must get back to London as soon as I can. There is some more work to be done for you, and the sooner I do it the better. She heard his excuse without heeding it. You are not like yourself, Robert, she said. Why is it? What are you thinking of? He was thinking of the bright blush that overspread her face when Hardyman first spoke to her. He was thinking of the invitation to her to see the stud farm, and to ride the roan mare. He was thinking of the utterly powerless position in which he stood towards Isabel and towards the highly born gentleman who admired her. But he kept his doubts and fears to himself. The train won't wait for me, he said, and he held out his hand once more. She was not only perplexed, she was really distressed. Don't take leave of me in that cold way, she pleaded. Her eyes dropped before his, and her lips trembled a little. Give me a kiss, Robert, at parting. She said those bold words softly and sadly, out of the depth of her pity for him. He started. His face brightened suddenly. His sinking hopes rose again. In another moment the change came. In another moment he understood her. As he touched her cheek with his lips, he turned pale again. Don't quite forget me, he said, in low, faltering tones, and left her. Miss Pink met Isabel in the hall. Refreshed by unbroken repose, the ex-schoolmistress was in the happiest frame of mind for the reception of her niece's news. Informed that Moody had traveled to South Morden to personally report the progress of the inquiries, Miss Pink highly approved of him as a substitute for Mr. Troy. Mr. Moody, as a banker's son, is a gentleman by birth, she remarked. He has condescended in becoming Lady Lydiard's steward. What I saw of him, when he came here with you, prepossessed me in his favor. He has my confidence, Isabel, as well as yours. He is, in every respect, a superior person to Mr. Troy. Did you meet any friends, my dear, when you were out walking? The answer to this question produced a species of transformation in Miss Pink. The rapturous rank worship of her nation feasted, so to speak, on Hardyman's message. She looked taller and younger than usual. She was all smiles and sweetness. At last, Isabel, you have seen birth and breeding under their right aspect, she said. In the society of Lady Lydiard, you cannot possibly have formed correct ideas of the English aristocracy. Observe Mr. Hardyman when he does me the honor to call tomorrow, and you will see the difference. Mr. Hardyman is your visitor, aunt, not mine. I was going to ask you to let me remain upstairs in my room. Miss Pink was unaffectedly shocked. This is what you learn at Lady Lydiard's? She observed. No, Isabel, your absence would be a breach of good manners. I cannot possibly permit it. You will be present to receive our distinguished friend with me. And mind this, added Miss Pink, in her most impressive manner, if Mr. Hardyman should by any chance ask why you have left Lady Lydiard, not one word about those disgraceful circumstances which connect you with the loss of the bank-note. I should sink into the earth if the smallest hint of what has really happened should reach Mr. Hardyman's ears. My child, I stand towards you in the place of your lamented mother. I have the right to command your silence on this horrible subject, and I do imperatively command it. In these words, foolish Miss Pink sowed the seed for the harvest of trouble that was soon to come. End of chapter 15. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Chapter 16 of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 16. Paying his court to the ex-schoolmistress on the next day, Hardyman made such excellent use of his opportunities that the visit to the stud farm took place on the day after. His own carriage was placed at the disposal of Isabel and her aunt, and his own sister was present to confer special distinction on the reception of Miss Pink. In a country like England, which annually suspends the sitting of its legislature in honor of a horse race, it is only natural and proper that the comfort of the horses should be the first object of consideration at a stud farm. 9/10 of the land at Hardyman's farm was devoted, in one way or another, to the noble quadruped with the low forehead and the long nose. Poor humanity was satisfied with second-rate and third-rate accommodation. The ornamental grounds, very poorly laid out, were also very limited in extent, and, as for the dwelling-house, it was literally a cottage. A parlor and a kitchen, a smoking-room, a bedroom, and a spare chamber for a friend, all scantily furnished, sufficed for the modest wants of the owner of the property. If you wished to feast your eyes on luxury, you went to the stables. The stud farm being described, the introduction to Hardyman's sister follows in due course. The Honorable Lavinia Hardyman was, as all persons in society know, married rather late in life to General Drumblade. It is saying a great deal, but it is not saying too much, to describe Mrs. Drumblade as the most mischievous woman of her age in all England. Scandal was the breath of her life. To place people in false positions, to divulge secrets and destroy characters, to undermine friendships, and aggravate enmities, these were the sources of enjoyment from which this dangerous woman drew the inexhaustible fund of good spirits that made her a brilliant light in the social sphere. She was one of the privileged sinners of modern society. The worst mischief that she could work was ascribed to her exuberant vitality. She had that ready familiarity of manner which is, in her class, so rarely discovered to be insolence in disguise. Her power of easy self-assertion found people ready to accept her on her own terms, wherever she went. She was one of those big, overpowering women, with blunt manners, voluble tongues, and goggle eyes, who carry everything before them. The highest society modestly considered itself in danger of being dull in the absence of Mrs. Drumblade. Even Hardyman himself, who saw as little of her as possible, whose frankly straightforward nature recoiled by instinct from contact with his sister, could think of no fitter person to make Miss Pink's reception agreeable to her, while he was devoting his own attentions to her niece. Mrs. Drumblade accepted the position thus offered with the most amiable readiness. In her own private mind she placed an interpretation on her brother's motives which did him the grossest injustice. She believed that Hardyman's designs on Isabel contemplated the most profligate result. To assist this purpose, while the girl's nearest relative was supposed to be taking care of her, was Mrs. Drumblade's idea of fun. Her worst enemies admitted that the Honorable Lavinia had redeeming qualities, and owned that a keen sense of humor was one of her merits. Was Miss Pink a likely person to resist the fascinations of Mrs. Drumblade? Alas, for the ex-schoolmistress! Before she had been 5 minutes at the farm, Hardyman's sister had fished for her, caught her, landed her. Poor Miss Pink! Mrs. Drumblade could assume a grave dignity of manner when the occasion called for it. She was grave, she was dignified, when Hardyman performed the ceremonies of introduction. She would not say she was charmed to meet Miss Pink. The ordinary slang of society was not for Miss Pink's ears. She would say she felt this introduction as a privilege. It was so seldom one met with persons of trained intellect in society. Mrs. Drumblade was already informed of Miss Pink's earlier triumphs in the instruction of youth. Mrs. Drumblade had not been blessed with children herself, but she had nephews and nieces, and she was anxious about their education, especially the nieces. What a sweet, modest girl Miss Isabel was! The fondest wish she could form for her nieces would be that they should resemble Miss Isabel when they grew up. The question was as to the best method of education. She would own that she had selfish motives in becoming acquainted with Miss Pink. They were at the farm, no doubt, to see Alfred's horses. Mrs. Drumblade did not understand horses; her interest was in the question of education. She might even confess that she had accepted Alfred's invitation in the hope of hearing Miss Pink's views. There would be opportunity, she trusted, for a little instructive conversation on that subject. It was, perhaps, ridiculous to talk, at her age, of feeling as if she was Miss Pink's pupil, and yet it exactly expressed the nature of the aspiration which was then in her mind. In these terms, feeling her way with the utmost nicety, Mrs. Drumblade wound the net of flattery round and round Miss Pink until her hold on that innocent lady was, in every sense of the word, secure. Before half the horses had been passed under review, Hardyman and Isabel were out of sight, and Mrs. Drumblade and Miss Pink were lost in the intricacies of the stables. "Excessively stupid of me. We had better go back, and establish ourselves comfortably in the parlor. When my brother misses us, he and your charming niece will return to look for us in the cottage." Under cover of this arrangement, the separation became complete. Miss Pink held forth on education to Mrs. Drumblade in the parlor, while Hardyman and Isabel were on their way to a paddock at the farthest limits of the property. "I'm afraid you are getting a little tired," said Hardyman. "Won't you take my arm?" Isabel was on her guard. She had not forgotten what Lady Lydiard had said to her. "No, thank you, Mr. Hardyman. I'm a better walker than you think." Hardyman continued the conversation in his blunt, resolute way. "I wonder whether you will believe me," he asked, "if I tell you that this is one of the happiest days in my life?" "I should think you were always happy," Isabel cautiously replied, "having such a pretty place to live in as this." Hardyman met that answer with one of his quietly positive denials. "A man is never happy by himself," he said. "He is happy with a companion. For instance, I'm happy with you." Isabel stopped and looked back. Hardyman's language was becoming a little too explicit. "Surely we have lost Mrs. Drumblade and my aunt," she said. "I don't see them anywhere." "You will see them directly. They are only a long way behind." With this assurance he returned, in his own obstinate way, to his one object in view. "Miss Isabel, I want to ask you a question. I am not a ladies' man. I speak my mind plainly to everybody, women included. Do you like being here today?" Isabel's gravity was not proof against this very downright question. "I should be hard to please," she said, laughing, "if I didn't enjoy my visit to the farm." Hardyman pushed steadily forward through the obstacle of the farm to the question of the farm's master. "You like being here?" he repeated. "Do you like me?" This was serious. Isabel drew back a little and looked at him. He waited with the most impenetrable gravity for her reply. "I think you can hardly expect me to answer that question," she said. "Why not?" "Our acquaintance has been a very short one, Mr. Hardyman, and, if you are so good as to forget the difference between us, I think I ought to remember it." "What difference?" "The difference in rank." Hardyman suddenly stood still, and emphasized his next words by digging his stick into the grass. "If anything I've said has vexed you," he began, "tell me so plainly, Miss Isabel, and I'll ask your pardon. But don't throw my rank in my face. I cut adrift from all that nonsense when I took this farm and got my living out of the horses. What has a man's rank to do with a man's feelings?" he went on, with another emphatic dig of his stick. I am quite serious in asking if you like me, for this good reason, that I like you. Yes, I do. You remember that day when I bled the old lady's dog? Well, I have found out since then that there's a sort of incompleteness in my life which I never suspected before. It's you who have put that idea into my head. You didn't mean it, I dare say, but you have done it all the same. I sat alone here yesterday morning smoking my pipe, and I didn't enjoy it. I breakfasted alone this morning, and I didn't enjoy that. I said to myself, she's coming to lunch. That's one comfort. I shall enjoy lunch. That's what I feel, roughly described. I don't suppose I've been 5 minutes together without thinking of you, now in one way and now in another, since the day when I first saw you. When a man comes to my time of life, and has had any experience, he knows what that means. It means, in plain English, that his heart is set on a woman. You're the woman. Isabel had thus far made several attempts to interrupt him, without success. But when Hardyman's confession attained its culminating point, she insisted on being heard. "If you will excuse me, sir," she interposed gravely, "I think I'd better go back to the cottage. My aunt is a stranger here, and she doesn't know where to look for us." "We don't want your aunt," Hardyman remarked, in his most positive manner. "We do want her," Isabel rejoined. "I won't venture to say it's wrong in you, Mr. Hardyman, to talk to me as you have just done, but I'm quite sure it's very wrong of me to listen." He looked at her with such unaffected surprise and distress that she stopped, on the point of leaving him, and tried to make herself better understood. "I had no intention of offending you, sir," she said a little confusedly. "I only wanted to remind you that there are some things which a gentleman in your position—" She stopped, tried to finish the sentence, failed, and began another. "If I had been a young lady in your own rank of life," she went on, "I might have thanked you for paying me a compliment, and have given you a serious answer. As it is, I am afraid that I must say that you have surprised and disappointed me. I can claim very little for myself, I know, but I did imagine, so long as there was nothing unbecoming in my conduct, that I had some right to your respect." Listening more and more impatiently, Hardyman took her by the hand, and burst out with another of his abrupt questions. "What can you possibly be thinking of?" he asked. She gave him no answer. She only looked at him reproachfully, and tried to release herself. Hardyman held her hand faster than ever. "I believe you think me an infernal scoundrel," he said. "I can stand a good deal, Miss Isabel, but I can't stand that. How have I failed in respect towards you, if you please? I have told you you're the woman my heart is set on. Well, isn't it plain what I want of you when I say that? Isabel Miller, I want you to be my wife." Isabel's only reply to this extraordinary proposal of marriage was a faint cry of astonishment, followed by a sudden trembling that shook her from head to foot. Hardyman put his arm round her with a gentleness which his oldest friend would have been surprised to see in him. "Take your time to think of it," he said, dropping back again into his usual quiet tone. "If you had known me a little better you wouldn't have mistaken me, and you wouldn't be looking at me now as if you were afraid to believe your own ears. What is there so very wonderful in my wanting to marry you? I don't set up for being a saint. When I was a younger man I was no better, and no worse, than other young men. I'm getting on now to middle life. I don't want romances and adventures. I want an easy existence with a nice, lovable woman who will make me a good wife. You're the woman, I tell you again. I know it by what I've seen of you myself, and by what I've heard of you from Lady Lydiard. She said you were prudent, and sweet-tempered, and affectionate, to which I wish to add that you have just the face and figure that I like, and the modest manners and the blessed absence of all slang in your talk, which I don't find in the young women I meet with in the present day. That's my view of it. I think for myself. What does it matter to me whether you're the daughter of a duke or the daughter of a dairyman? It isn't your father I want to marry, it's you. Listen to reason, there's a dear. We have only one question to settle before we go back to your aunt. You wouldn't answer me when I asked it a little while since. Will you answer now? Do you like me?" Isabel looked up at him timidly. "In my position, sir," she asked, "have I any right to like you? What would your relations and friends think if I said yes?" Hardyman gave her waist a little admonitory squeeze with his arm. "What, you're at it again? A nice way to answer a man, to call him sir, and to get behind his rank, as if it was a place of refuge from him. I hate talking of myself, but you force me to it. Here is my position in the world. I have got an elder brother, he is married, and he has a son to succeed him in the title and the property. You understand so far? Very well. Years ago I shifted my share of the rank, whatever it may be, on to my brother's shoulders. He is a thorough good fellow, and he has carried my dignity for me, without once dropping it, ever since. As for what people may say, they have said it already, from my father and mother downward, in the time when I took to the horses and the farm. If they're the wise people I take them for, they won't be at the trouble of saying it all over again. No, no. Twist it how you may, Miss Isabel, whether I'm single or whether I'm married, I'm plain Alfred Hardyman, and everybody who knows me knows that I go on my way and please myself. If you don't like me, it will be the bitterest disappointment I ever had in my life, but say so honestly, all the same. Where is the woman in Isabel's place whose capacity for resistance would not have yielded a little to such an appeal as this? "I should be an insensible wretch," she replied warmly, "if I didn't feel the honor you have done me, and feel it gratefully." "Does that mean you will have me for a husband?" asked downright Hardyman. She was fairly driven into a corner, but, being a woman, she tried to slip through his fingers at the last moment. "Will you forgive me," she said, "if I ask you for a little more time? I'm so bewildered, I hardly know what to say or do for the best. You see, Mr. Hardyman, it would be a dreadful thing for me to be the cause of giving offense to your family. I am obliged to think of that. It would be so distressing for you I will say nothing of myself if your friends closed their doors on me. They might say I was a designing girl, who had taken advantage of your good opinion to raise herself in the world. Lady Lydiard warned me long since not to be ambitious about myself, and not to forget my station in life, because she treated me like her adopted daughter. Indeed, indeed, I can't tell you how I feel your goodness, and the compliment, the very great compliment, you pay me. My heart is free, and if I followed my own inclinations—" She checked herself, conscious that she was on the brink of saying too much. "Will you give me a few days," she pleaded, "to try if I can think composedly of all this? I am only a girl, and I feel quite dazzled by the prospect that you set before me." Hardyman seized on those words as offering all the encouragement that he desired to his suit. "Have your own way in this thing and in everything," he said, with an unaccustomed fervor of language and manner. "I am so glad to hear that your heart is open to me, and that all your inclinations take my part." Isabel instantly protested against this misrepresentation of what she had really said. "Oh, Mr. Hardyman, you quite mistake me." He answered her very much as he had answered Lady Lydiard, when she had tried to make him understand his proper relations towards Isabel. "No, no, I don't mistake you. I agree to every word you say. How can I expect you to marry me, as you very properly remark, unless I give you a day or two to make up your mind? It is quite enough for me that you like the prospect. If Lady Lydiard treated you as her daughter, why shouldn't you be my wife? It stands to reason that you're quite right to marry a man who can raise you in the world. I like you to be ambitious, though heaven knows it isn't much I can do for you, except to love you with all my heart. Still, it is a great encouragement to hear that her ladyship's views agree with mine." "They don't agree, Mr. Hardyman," protested poor Isabel. "You are entirely misrepresenting—" Hardyman cordially concurred in this view of the matter. "Yes, yes, I can't pretend to represent her ladyship's language, or yours either. I'm obliged to take my words as they come to me. Don't disturb yourself. It's all right, I understand. You have made me the happiest man living. I shall ride over to-morrow to your aunt's house, and hear what you have to say to me. Mind you're at home. Not a day must pass now without my seeing you. I do love you, Isabel, I do indeed." He stooped and kissed her heartily. "Only to reward me," he explained, "for giving you time to think." She drew herself away from him, resolutely, not angrily. Before she could make a third attempt to place the subject in its right light before him, the luncheon bell rang at the cottage, and a servant appeared evidently sent to look for them. "Don't forget to-morrow," Hardyman whispered confidentially. "I'll call early, and then go to London and get the ring." End of chapter 16. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.
Chapter 17 of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 17. Events succeeded each other rapidly. After the memorable day to Elizabeth of the luncheon at the farm, on the next day, the 9th of the month, Lady Lydiard sent for her steward, and requested him to explain his conduct in repeatedly leaving the house without assigning any reason for his absence. She did not dispute his claims to a freedom of action which would not be permitted to an ordinary servant. Her objection to his present course of proceeding related entirely to the mystery in which it was involved, and to the uncertainty in which the household was left as to the hour of his return. On those grounds, she thought herself entitled to an explanation. Moody's habitual reserve, strengthened on this occasion by his dread of ridicule, if his efforts to serve Isabel ended in failure, disinclined him to take Lady Lydiard into his confidence, while his inquiries were still beset with obstacles and doubts. He respectfully entreated her ladyship to grant him a delay of a few weeks before he entered on his explanation. Lady Lydiard's quick temper resented his request. She told Moody plainly that he was guilty of an act of presumption in making his own conditions with his employer. He received the reproof with exemplary resignation, but he held to his conditions nevertheless. From that moment the result of the interview was no longer in doubt. Moody was directed to send in his accounts. The accounts having been examined, and found to be scrupulously correct, he declined accepting the balance of salary that was offered to him. The next day he left Lady Lydiard's service. On the 10th of the month her ladyship received a letter from her nephew. The health of Felix had not improved. He had made up his mind to go abroad again towards the end of the month. In the meantime, he had written to his friend in Paris, and he had the pleasure of forwarding an answer. The letter enclosed announced that the lost £500 note had not been made the subject of careful inquiry in Paris. It had not been traced. The French police offered to send to London one of their best men, well acquainted with the English language. If Lady Lydiard was desirous of employing him, he would be perfectly willing to act with an English officer in conducting the investigation, should it be thought necessary. Mr. Troy, being consulted as to the expediency of accepting this proposal, objected to the pecuniary terms demanded as being extravagantly high. He suggested waiting a little before any reply was sent to Paris, and he engaged meanwhile to consult a London solicitor who had great experience in cases of theft, and whose advice might enable them to dispense entirely with the services of the French police. Being now a free man again, Moody was able to follow his own inclinations in regard to the instructions which he had received from Old Sharon. The course that had been recommended to him was repellent to the self-respect and the sense of delicacy which were among the inbred virtues of Moody's character. He shrank from forcing himself as a friend on Hardyman's valet. He recoiled from the idea of tempting the man to steal a specimen of his master's handwriting. After some consideration, he decided on applying to the agent who collected the rents at Hardyman's London chambers. Being an old acquaintance of Moody's, this person would certainly not hesitate to communicate the address of Hardyman's bankers, if he knew it. The experiment, tried under these favouring circumstances, proved perfectly successful. Moody proceeded to Sharon's lodgings the same day, with the address of the bankers in his pocket-book. The old vagabond, greatly amused by Moody's scruples, saw plainly enough that, so long as he wrote the supposed letter from Hardyman in the third person, it mattered little what handwriting was employed, seeing that no signature would be necessary. The letter was at once composed on the model which Sharon had already suggested to Moody, and a respectable messenger, so far as outward appearances went, was employed to take it to the bank. In half an hour the answer came back. It added one more to the difficulties which beset the inquiry after the lost money. No such sum as £500 had been paid within the dates mentioned to the credit of Hardyman's account. Old Sharon was not in the least discomposed by this fresh check. "Give my love to the dear young lady," he said with his customary impudence, "and tell her we are 1 degree nearer to finding the thief." Moody looked at him, doubting whether he was in jest or in earnest. "Must I squeeze a little more information into that thick head of yours?" asked Sharon. With this question he produced a weekly newspaper, and pointed to a paragraph which reported, among the items of sporting news, Hardyman's recent visit to a sale of horses at a town in the north of France. "We know he didn't pay the banknote in to his account," Sharon remarked. "What else did he do with it?" "Took it to pay for the horses that he bought in France. Do you see your way a little plainer now? Very good. Let's try next if your money holds out. Somebody must cross the channel in search of the note. Which of us two is to sit in the steamboat with a white basin on his lap? Old Sharon, of course." He stopped to count the money still left, out of the sum deposited by Moody to defray the cost of the inquiry. "All right," he went on. "I've got enough to pay my expenses there and back. Don't stir out of London till you hear from me. I can't tell how soon I may not want you. If there's any difficulty in tracing the note, your hand will have to go into your pocket again. Can't you get the lawyer to join you? Lord, how I should enjoy squandering his money! It's a downright disgrace to me to have only got 1 guinea out of him. I could tear my flesh off my bones when I think of it." The same night old Sharon started for France, by way of Dover and Calais. 2 days elapsed, and brought no news from Moody's agent. On the third day he received some information relating to Sharon, not from the man himself, but in a letter from Isabel Miller. "For once, dear Robert," she wrote, "my judgment has turned out to be sounder than yours. That hateful old man has confirmed my worst opinion of him. Pray have him punished. Take him before a magistrate and charge him with cheating you out of your money. I enclose the sealed letter which he gave me at the farmhouse. The week's time before I was to open it expired yesterday. Was there ever anything so impudent and so inhuman? I am too vexed and angry about the money you have wasted on this old wretch to write more. Yours gratefully and affectionately, Isabel." The letter in which old Sharon had undertaken, by way of pacifying Isabel, to write the name of the thief, contained these lines: "You are a charming girl, my dear, but you still want one thing to make you perfect, and that is a lesson in patience. I am proud and happy to teach you. The name of the thief remains, for the present, Mr. Blank." From Moody's point of view, there was but one thing to be said of this. It was just like old Sharon. Isabel's letter was of infinitely greater interest to him. He feasted his eyes on the words above the signature. She signed herself, "Yours gratefully and affectionately." Did the last words mean that she was really beginning to be fond of him? After kissing the word, he wrote a comforting letter to her, in which he pledged himself to keep a watchful eye on Sharon, and to trust him with no more money until he had honestly earned it first. A week passed. Moody, longing to see Isabel, still waited in vain for news from France. He had just decided to delay his visit to South Morden no longer, when the errand boy employed by Sharon brought him this message: "The old on's at home, and waitin' to see her." Chapter 18 of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 18. Sharon's news was not of an encouraging character. He had met with serious difficulties, and had spent the last farthing of Moody's money in attempting to overcome them. One discovery of importance he had certainly made. A horse withdrawn from the sale was the only horse that had met with Hardyman's approval. He had secured the animal at the high reserved price of 12,000 francs, being £480 in English money, and he had paid with an English bank note. The seller, a French horse dealer resident in Brussels, had returned to Belgium immediately on completing the negotiations. Sharon had ascertained his address, and had written to him at Brussels, enclosing the number of the lost bank note. In 2 days he had received an answer, informing him that the horse dealer had been called to England by the illness of a relative, and that he had hitherto failed to send any address to which his letters could be forwarded. Hearing this, and having exhausted his funds, Sharon had returned to London. It now rested with Moody to decide whether the course of the inquiry should follow the horse dealer next. Here was the cash account, showing how the money had been spent, and there was Sharon, with his pipe in his mouth and his dog on his lap, waiting for orders. Moody wisely took time to consider before he committed himself to a decision. In the meanwhile, he ventured to recommend a new course of proceeding which Sharon's report had suggested to his mind. "It seems to me," he said, "that we have taken the roundabout way of getting to our end in view, when the straight road lay before us. If Mr. Hardyman has passed the stolen note, you know, as well as I do, that he has passed it innocently. Instead of wasting time and money in trying to trace a stranger, why not tell Mr. Hardyman what has happened, and ask him to give us the number of the note? You can't think of everything, I know, but it does seem strange that this idea didn't occur to you before you went to France." "Mr. Moody," said Old Sharon, "I shall have to cut your acquaintance. You are a man without faith. I don't like you." "As if I hadn't thought of Hardyman weeks since!" he exclaimed contemptuously. "Are you really soft enough to suppose that a gentleman in his position would talk about his money affairs to me? You know mighty little of him if you do. A fortnight since I sent one of my men, most respectably dressed, to hang out about his farm, and see what information he could pick up. My man became painfully acquainted with the toe of a boot. It was thick, sir, and it was Hardyman's." "I will run the risk of the boot," replied Hardyman in his quiet way. "And put the question to Hardyman?" "Yes." "Very good," said Sharon. "If you get your answer from his tongue instead of his boot, the case is cleared up, unless I have made a complete mess of it. Look here, Moody, if you want to do me a good turn, tell the lawyer that the guinea opinion was the right one. Let him know that he was the fool, not you, when he buttoned up his pockets and refused to trust me. And I say," pursued Old Sharon, relapsing into his customary impudence, "you're in love, you know, with that nice girl. I like her myself. When you marry her, invite me to the wedding. I'll make a sacrifice. I'll brush my hair and wash my face in honor of the occasion." Returning to his lodgings, Moody found 2 letters waiting on the table. One of them bore the South Morden postmark. He opened that letter first. It was written by Miss Pink. The first lines contained an urgent entreaty to keep the circumstances connected with the loss of the £500 the strictest secret from everyone in general, and from Hardyman in particular. The reasons assigned for making the strange request were next expressed in these terms: "My niece Isabel is, I am happy to inform you, engaged to be married to Mr. Hardyman. If the slightest hint reached him of her having been associated, no matter how cruelly and unjustly, with a suspicion of theft, the marriage would be broken off, and the result to herself and to everybody connected with her would be disgrace for the rest of our lives. On the blank space at the foot of the page a few words were added in Isabel's writing. Whatever changes there may be in my life, your place in my heart is one that no other person can fill. It is the place of my dearest friend. Pray write, and tell me that you are not distressed and not angry. My one anxiety is that you should remember what I have always told you about the state of my own feelings. My one wish is that you will still let me love you and value you, as I might have loved and valued a brother." The letter dropped from Moody's hand. Not a word, not even a sigh, passed his lips. In tearless silence he submitted to the pang that wrung him. In tearless silence he contemplated the wreck of his life. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 19. The narrative returns to South Morden and follows the events which attended Isabel's marriage engagement. To say that Miss Pink, inflated by the triumph, rose, morally speaking, from the earth and floated among the clouds, is to indicate faintly the effect produced on the ex-schoolmistress when her niece first informed her of what had happened at the farm. Attacked on one side by her aunt and on the other by Hardyman, and feebly defended at the best by her own doubts and misgivings, Isabel ended by surrendering at discretion. Like thousands of other women in a similar position, she was in the last degree uncertain as to the state of her own heart. To what extent she was insensibly influenced by Hardyman's commanding position in believing herself to be sincerely attached to him, it was beyond her power of self-examination to discover. He doubly dazzled her by his birth and by his celebrity. Not in England only, but throughout Europe, he was a recognized authority on his own subject. How could she, how could any woman, resist the influence of his steady mind, his firmness of purpose, his manly resolution to owe everything to himself and nothing to his rank? Set off as these attractive qualities were by the outward and personal advantages which exercise an ascendancy of their own, Isabel was fascinated, and yet Isabel was not at ease. In her lonely moments she was troubled by regretful thoughts of Moody, which perplexed and irritated her. She had always behaved honestly to him. She had never encouraged him to hope that his love for her had the faintest prospect of being returned. Yet, knowing as she did that her conduct was blameless so far, there were nevertheless perverse sympathies in her which took his part. In the wakeful hours of the night there were whispering voices in her which said, "Think of Moody." Had there been a growing kindness towards this good friend in her heart, of which she herself was not aware? She tried to detect it, to weigh it for what it was really worth. But it lay too deep to be discovered and estimated, if it did really exist, if it had any sounder origin than her own morbid fancy. In the broad light of day, in the little bustling duties of life, she forgot it again. She could think of what she ought to wear on the wedding day. She could even try privately how her new signature, Isabel Hardyman, would look when she had the right to use it. On the whole, it may be said that the time passed smoothly, with some occasional checks and drawbacks, which were the more easily endured seeing that they took their rise in Isabel's own conduct. Compliant as she was in general, there were 2 instances among others in which her resolution to take her own way was not to be overcome. She refused to write either to Moody or to Lady Lydiard, informing them of her engagement, and she steadily disapproved of Miss Pink's policy of concealment in the matter of the robbery at Lady Lydiard's house. Her aunt could only secure her as a passive accomplice by stating family considerations in the strongest possible terms. "If the disgrace was confined to you, my dear, I might leave you to decide, but I am involved in it as your nearest relative, and, what is more, even the sacred memory of your father and mother might feel the slur cast on them." This exaggerated language, like all exaggerated language a mischievous weapon in the arsenal of weakness and prejudice, had its effect on Isabel. Reluctantly and sadly she consented to be silent. Miss Pink wrote word of the engagement to Moody first, reserving to a later day the superior pleasure of informing Lady Lydiard of the very event which that audacious woman had declared to be impossible. To her aunt's surprise, just as she was about to close the envelope, Isabel stepped forward and inconsistently requested leave to add a postscript to the very letter which she had refused to write. Miss Pink was not even permitted to see the postscript. Isabel secured the envelope the moment she laid down her pen, and retired to her room with a headache, which was heartache in disguise, for the rest of the day. While the question of marriage was still in debate, an event occurred which exercised a serious influence on Hardyman's future plans. He received a letter from the Continent which claimed his immediate attention. One of the sovereigns of Europe had decided on making some radical changes in the mounting and equipment of a cavalry regiment, and he required the assistance of Hardyman in that important part of the contemplated reform which was connected with the choice and purchase of horses. Setting his own interests out of the question, Hardyman owed obligations to the kindness of his illustrious correspondent, which made it impossible for him to send an excuse. In a fortnight's time at the latest it would be necessary for him to leave England, and a month or more might elapse before it would be possible for him to return. Under these circumstances he proposed, in his own precipitate way, to hasten the date of the marriage. The necessary legal delay would permit the ceremony to be performed on that day fortnight. Isabel might then accompany him on his journey and spend a brilliant honeymoon at the foreign court. She at once refused not only to accept his proposal, but even to take it into consideration. While Miss Pink dwelt eloquently on the shortness of the notice, Miss Pink's niece based her resolution on far more important grounds. Hardyman had not yet announced the contemplated marriage to his parents and friends, and Isabel was determined not to become his wife until she could be first assured of a courteous and tolerant reception by the family, if she could hope for no warmer welcome at their hands. Hardyman was not a man who yielded easily, even in trifles. In the present case his dearest interests were concerned in inducing Isabel to reconsider her decision. He was still vainly trying to shake her resolution when the afternoon post brought a letter from Miss Pink, which introduced a new element of disturbance into the discussion. The letter was nothing less than Lady Lydiard's reply to the written announcement of Isabel's engagement, dispatched on the previous day by Miss Pink. Her ladyship's answer was a surprisingly short one. It only contained these lines: Lady Lydiard begs to acknowledge the receipt of Miss Pink's letter, requesting that she will say nothing to Mr. Hardyman of the loss of a bank note in her house, and assigning as a reason that Miss Isabel Miller is engaged to be married to Mr. Hardyman, and might be prejudiced in his estimation if the facts were made known. Miss Pink may make her mind easy. Lady Lydiard had not the slightest intention of taking Mr. Hardyman into her confidence on the subject of her domestic affairs. With regard to the proposed marriage, Lady Lydiard casts no doubt on Miss Pink's perfect sincerity and good faith, but, at the same time, she positively declines to believe that Mr. Hardyman means to make Miss Isabel Miller his wife. Lady L. will yield to the evidence of a properly attested certificate, and to nothing else. A folded piece of paper directed to Isabel dropped out of this characteristic letter as Miss Pink turned from the first page to the second. Lady Lydiard addressed her adopted daughter in these words: I was on the point of leaving home to visit you again when I received your aunt's letter. My poor deluded child, no words can tell how distressed I am about you. You are already sacrificed to the folly of the most foolish woman living. For God's sake, take care you do not fall a victim next to the designs of a profligate man. Come to me instantly, Isabel, and I promise to take care of you. Fortified by these letters, and aided by Miss Pink's indignation, Hardyman pressed his proposal on Isabel with renewed resolution. She made no attempt to combat his arguments, she only held firmly to her decision. Without some encouragement from Hardyman's father and mother, she still steadily refused to become his wife. Irritated already by Lady Lydiard's letters, he lost the self-command which so eminently distinguished him in the ordinary affairs of life, and showed the domineering and despotic temper which was an inbred part of his disposition. Isabel's high spirit at once resented the harsh terms in which he spoke to her. In the plainest words she released him from his engagement, and, without waiting for his excuses, quitted the room. Left together, Hardyman and Miss Pink devised an arrangement which paid due respect to Isabel's scruples, and, at the same time, met Lady Lydiard's insulting assertion of disbelief in Hardyman's honour, by a formal and public announcement of the marriage. It was proposed to give a garden party at the farm in a week's time for the express purpose of introducing Isabel to Hardyman's family and friends in the character of his betrothed wife. If his father and mother accepted the invitation, Isabel's only objection to hastening the union would fall to the ground. Hardyman might in that case plead with his imperial correspondent for a delay in his departure of a few days more, and the marriage might still take place before he left England. Isabel, at Miss Pink's intercession, was induced to accept her lover's excuses, and, in the event of her favourable reception by Hardyman's parents at the farm, to give her consent, not very willingly even yet, to hastening the ceremony which was to make her Hardyman's wife. On the next morning the whole of the invitations were sent out, excepting the invitation to Hardyman's father and mother. Without mentioning it to Isabel, Hardyman decided on personally appealing to his mother before he ventured on taking the head of the family into his confidence. The result of the interview was partially successful and no more. Lord Rotherfield declined to see his youngest son, and he had engagements which would, under any circumstances, prevent his being present at the garden party. But at the express request of Lady Rotherfield, he was willing to make certain concessions. "I have always regarded Alfred as a barely sane person," said his lordship, "since he turned his back on his prospects to become a horse dealer. If we decline altogether to sanction this new act, I won't say of insanity, I will say of absurdity, on his part, it is impossible to predict to what discreditable extremities he may not proceed. We must temporize with Alfred. In the meantime I shall endeavour to obtain some information respecting this young person, named Miller, I think you said, and now resident at South Morden. If I am satisfied that she is a woman of reputable character, possessing an average education and presentable manners, we may as well let Alfred take his own way. He is out of the pale of society as it is, and Miss Miller has no father and mother to complicate matters, which is distinctly a merit on her part, and, in short, if the marriage is not absolutely disgraceful, the wisest way, as we have no power to prevent it, will be to submit. You will say nothing to Alfred about what I propose to do. I tell you plainly I don't trust him. You will simply inform him from me that I want time to consider, and that, unless he hears to the contrary in the interval, he may expect to have the sanction of your presence at his breakfast, or luncheon, or whatever it is. I must go to town in a day or two, and I shall ascertain what Alfred's friends know about this last of his many follies, if I meet any of them at the club." Returning to South Morden in no serene frame of mind, Hardyman found Isabel in a state of depression which perplexed and alarmed him. The news that his mother might be expected to present at the garden party failed entirely to raise her spirits. The only explanation she gave of the change in her was that the dull heavy weather of the last few days made her feel a little languid and nervous. Naturally dissatisfied with this reply to his inquiries, Hardyman asked for Miss Pink. He was informed that Miss Pink could not see him. She was constitutionally subject to asthma, and, having warnings of the return of the malady, she was, by the doctor's advice, keeping her room. Hardyman returned to the farm in a temper which was felt by everybody in his employment, from the trainer to the stable boys. While the apology made for Miss Pink stated no more than the plain truth, it must be confessed that Hardyman was right in declining to be satisfied with Isabel's excuse for the melancholy that oppressed her. She had that morning received Moody's answer to the lines which she had addressed to him at the end of her aunt's letter, and she had not yet recovered from the effect which it had produced on her spirits. "It is impossible for me to say honestly that I am not distressed," Moody wrote, "by the news of your marriage engagement. The blow has fallen very heavily on me. When I look at the future now, I see only a dreary blank. This is not your fault. You are in no way to blame. I remember the time when I should have been too angry to own this, when I might have said or done things which I should have bitterly repented afterwards. That time is past. My temper has been softened since I have befriended you in your troubles. That good at least has come out of my foolish hopes, and perhaps out of the true sympathy which I have felt for you. I can honestly ask you to accept my heart's dearest wishes for your happiness, and I can keep the rest to myself. Let me say a word now relating to the efforts that I have made to help you since that sad day when you left Lady Lydiard's house. I had hoped, for reasons which it is needless to mention here, to interest Mr. Hardyman himself in aiding our inquiry, but your aunt's wishes, as expressed in her letter to me, closed my lips. I will only beg you at some convenient time to let me mention the last discoveries that we have made, leaving it to your discretion, when Mr. Hardyman has become your husband, to ask him the questions which, under other circumstances, I should have put to him myself. It is, of course, possible that the view I take of Mr. Hardyman's capacity to help us may be a mistaken one. In this case, if you still wish the investigation to be privately carried on, I entreat you to let me continue to direct it, as the greatest favour you can confer on your devoted old friend. You need be under no apprehension about the expense to which you are likely to put me. I have unexpectedly inherited what is to me a handsome fortune. The same post which brought your aunt's letter brought a line from a lawyer asking me to see him on the subject of my late father's affairs. I waited a day or two before I could summon heart enough to see him, or to see anybody, and then I went to his office. You have heard that my father's bank stopped payment at a time of commercial panic. His failure was mainly attributable to the treachery of a friend to whom he had lent a large sum of money, and who paid him the yearly interest without acknowledging that every farthing of it had been lost in unsuccessful speculations. The son of this man has prospered in business, and he has honourably devoted a part of his wealth to the payment of my father's creditors. Half the sum due to my father has thus passed into my hands as his next of kin, and the other half is to follow in course of time. If my hopes had been fulfilled, how gladly I should have shared my prosperity with you. As it is, I have far more than enough for my wants as a lonely man, and plenty left to spend in your service. God bless and prosper you, my dear. I shall ask you to accept a little present from me among the other offerings that are made to you before the wedding day. R.M. The studiously considerate and delicate tone in which these lines were written had an effect on Isabel which was exactly the opposite of the effect intended by the writer. She burst into a passionate fit of tears, and in the safe solitude of her own room the despairing words escaped her. I wish I had died before I met with Alfred Hardyman. As the days wore on, disappointment and difficulties seemed by a kind of fatality to beset the contemplated announcement of the marriage. Miss Pink's asthma, developed by the unfavourable weather, set the doctor's art at defiance, and threatened to keep that unfortunate lady a prisoner in her room on the day of the party. Hardyman's invitations were in some cases refused, and in others accepted by husbands with excuses for the absence of their wives. His elder brother made an apology for himself as well as for his wife. Felix Sweetser wrote, "With pleasure, dear Alfred, if my health permits me to leave the house." Lady Lydiard, invited at Miss Pink's special request, sent no reply. The one encouraging circumstance was the silence of Lady Rutherfield. So long as her son received no intimation to the contrary, it was a sign that Lord Rutherfield permitted his wife to sanction the marriage by her presence. Hardyman wrote to his imperial correspondent, engaging to leave England on the earliest possible day, and asking to be pardoned if he failed to express himself more definitely, in consideration of domestic affairs, which it was necessary to settle before he started for the Continent. If there should not be time enough to write again, he promised to send a telegraphic announcement of his departure. Long afterwards Hardyman remembered the misgivings that had troubled him when he wrote that letter. In the rough draft of it he had mentioned as his excuse for not being yet certain of his own movements that he expected to be immediately married. In the fair copy, the vague foreboding of some accident to come was so painfully present to his mind that he struck out the words which referred to his marriage and substituted the designedly indefinite phrase domestic affairs. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins, Chapter 20. The day of the garden party arrived. There was no rain, but the air was heavy and the sky was overcast by lowering clouds. Some hours before the guests were expected, Isabel arrived alone at the farm, bearing the apologies of unfortunate Miss Pink, still kept a prisoner in her bedchamber by the asthma. In the confusion produced at the cottage by the preparations for entertaining the company, the one room in which Hardyman could receive Isabel, with the certainty of not being interrupted, was the smoking room. To this haven of refuge he led her, still reserved and silent, still not restored to her customary spirits. "If any visitors come before the time," Hardyman said to his servant, Tell them I am engaged at the stables. I must have an hour's quiet talk with you," he continued, turning to Isabel, "or I shall be in too bad a temper to receive my guests with common politeness. The worry of giving this party is not to be told in words. I almost wish I had been content with presenting you to my mother, and had let the rest of my acquaintances go to the devil." A quiet half hour passed, and the first visitor, a stranger to the servants, appeared at the cottage gate. He was a middle-aged man, and he had no wish to disturb Mr. Hardyman. "I will wait in the grounds," he said, "and trouble nobody." The middle-aged man who expressed himself in these modest terms was Robert Moody. 5 minutes later a carriage drove up to the gate. An elderly lady got out of it, followed by a fat white Scotch terrier, who growled at every stranger within his reach. It is needless to introduce Lady Lydiard and Tommy. Informed that Mr. Hardyman was at the stables, Lady Lydiard gave the servant her card. "Take that to your master, and say I won't detain him 5 minutes." With these words her ladyship sauntered into the grounds. She looked about her with observant eyes, not only noticing the tent which had been set up on the grass to accommodate the expected guests, but entering it and looking at the waiters, who were engaged in placing the luncheon on the table. Returning to the outer world, she next remarked that Mr. Hardyman's lawn was in very bad order. Barren sun-dried patches and little holes and crevices opened here and there by the action of the summer heat announced that the lawn, like everything else at the farm, had been neglected in the exclusive attention paid to the claims of the horses. Reaching a shrubbery which bounded one side of the grounds next, her ladyship became aware of a man slowly approaching her, to all appearance absorbed in thought. The man drew a little nearer. She lifted her glasses to her eyes and recognized Moody. No embarrassment was produced on either side by this unexpected meeting. Lady Lydiard had, not long since, sent to ask her former steward to visit her, regretting in her warm-hearted way the terms on which they had separated, and wishing to atone for the harsh language that escaped her at their parting interview. In the friendly talk which followed the reconciliation, Lady Lydiard not only heard the news of Moody's pecuniary inheritance, but, noticing the change in his appearance for the worse, contrived to extract from him the confession of his ill-starred passion for Isabel. To discover him now, after all that he had acknowledged, walking about the grounds at Hardyman's farm, took her ladyship completely by surprise. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed in her loudest tones. "What are you doing here?" "You mentioned Mr. Hardyman's garden party, my lady, when I had the honour of waiting on you," Moody answered. "Thinking over it afterward, it seemed the fittest occasion I could find for making a little wedding present to Miss Isabel. Is there any harm in my asking Mr. Hardyman to let me put the present on her plate, so that she may see it when she sits down to luncheon? If your ladyship thinks so, I will go away directly and send the gift by post." Lady Lydiard looked at him attentively. "You don't despise the girl," she asked, "for selling herself for rank and money? I do, I can tell you." Moody's worn white face flushed a little. "No, my lady," he answered. "I can't hear you say that. Isabel would not have engaged herself to Mr. Hardyman unless she had been fond of him, as fond, I dare say, as I once hoped she might be of me. It's a hard thing to confess that, but I do confess it, in justice to her, God bless her." The generosity that spoke in those simple words touched the finest sympathies in Lady Lydiard's nature. "Give me your hand," she said, with her own generous spirit kindling in her eyes. "You have a great heart, Moody. Isabel Miller is a fool for not marrying you, and one day she will know it." Before a word more could pass between them, Hardyman's voice was audible on the other side of the shrubbery, calling irritably to his servant to find Lady Lydiard. Moody retired to the further end of the walk, while Lady Lydiard advanced in the opposite direction, so as to meet Hardyman at the entrance to the shrubbery. He bowed stiffly, and begged to know why her ladyship had honoured him with a visit. Lady Lydiard replied without noticing the coldness of her reception. "I have not been very well, Mr. Hardyman, or you would have seen me before this. My only object in presenting myself here is to make my excuses personally for having written of you in terms which expressed a doubt of your honour. I have done you an injustice, and I beg you to forgive me." Hardyman acknowledged this frank apology as unreservedly as it had been offered to him. "Say no more, Lady Lydiard, and let me hope, now you are here, that you will honour my little party with your presence." Lady Lydiard gravely stated her reasons for not accepting the invitation. "I disapprove so strongly of unequal marriages," she said, walking on slowly towards the cottage, "that I cannot, in common consistency, become one of your guests. I shall always feel interested in Isabel Miller's welfare, and I can honestly say I shall be glad if your married life proves that my old-fashioned prejudices are without justification in your case. Accept my thanks for your invitation, and let me hope that my plain speaking has not offended you." She bowed, and looked about her for Tommy before she advanced to the carriage waiting for her at the gate. In the surprise of seeing Moody, she had forgotten to look back for the dog when she entered the shrubbery. She now called to him and blew the whistle at her watch chain. Not a sign of Tommy was to be seen. Hardyman instantly directed the servants to search in the cottage and out of the cottage for the dog. The order was obeyed with all needful activity and intelligence, and entirely without success. For the time being, at any rate, Tommy was lost. Hardyman promised to have the dog looked for in every part of the farm, and to send him back in the care of one of his own men. With these polite assurances Lady Lydiard was obliged to be satisfied. She drove away in a very despondent frame of mind. "First Isabel, and now Tommy," thought her ladyship. "I am losing the only companions who made life tolerable to me." Returning from the garden gate, after taking leave of his visitor, Hardyman received from his servant a handful of letters which had just arrived for him. Walking slowly over the lawn as he opened them, he found nothing but excuses for the absence of guests who had already accepted their invitations. He had just thrust the letters into his pocket when he heard footsteps behind him and, looking around, found himself confronted by Moody. "Hello! Have you come to lunch?" Hardyman asked roughly. "I have come here, sir, with a little gift for Miss Isabel, in honor of her marriage," Moody answered quietly, "and I ask your permission to put it on the table so that she may see it when your guests sit down to luncheon." He opened a jeweller's case as he spoke, containing a plain gold bracelet with an inscription engraved on the inner side, "To Miss Isabel Miller, with the sincere good wishes of Robert Moody." Plain as it was, the design of the bracelet was unusually beautiful. Hardyman had noticed Moody's agitation on the day when he had met Isabel near her aunt's house, and had drawn his own conclusions from it. His face darkened with a momentary jealousy as he looked at the bracelet. "All right, old fellow," he said, with a contemptuous familiarity. "Don't be modest. Wait and give it to her with your own hand." "No, sir," said Moody. "I would rather leave it, if you please, to speak for itself." Hardyman understood the delicacy of feeling which dictated those words, and, without well knowing why, resented it. He was on the point of speaking, under the influence of this unworthy motive, when Isabel's voice reached his ears, calling to him from the cottage. Moody's face contracted with a sudden expression of pain as he, too, recognized the voice. "Don't let me detain you, sir," he said sadly. "Good morning." Hardyman left him without ceremony. Moody, slowly following, entered the tent. All the preparations for the luncheon had been completed. Nobody was there. The places to be occupied by the guests were indicated by cards bearing their names. Moody found Isabel's card, and put his bracelet inside the folded napkin on her plate. For a while he stood with his hand on the table, thinking. The temptation to communicate once more with Isabel before he lost her forever was fast getting the better of his powers of resistance. "If I could persuade her to write a word to say she liked her bracelet," he thought, "it would be a comfort when I go back to my solitary life." He tore a leaf out of his pocket-book, and wrote on it, "One line to say you accept my gift and my good wishes. Put it under the cushion of your chair, and I shall find it when the company have left the tent." He slipped the paper into the case which held the bracelet, and, instead of leaving the farm as he had intended, turned back to the shelter of the shrubbery. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 21. Hardyman went on to the cottage. He found Isabel in some agitation, and there by her side, with his tail wagging slowly and his eye on Hardyman in expectation of a possible kick, there was the lost Tommy. "Has Lady Lydiard gone?" Isabel asked eagerly. "Yes," said Hardyman. "Where did you find the dog?" As events had ordered it, the dog had found Isabel under these circumstances. The appearance of Lady Lydiard's card in the smoking-room had been an alarming event for Lady Lydiard's adopted daughter. She was guiltily conscious of not having answered her ladyship's note, enclosed in Miss Pink's letter, and of not having taken her ladyship's advice in regulating her conduct towards Hardyman. As he rose to leave the room and receive his visitor in the grounds, Isabel begged him to say nothing of her presence at the farm, unless Lady Lydiard exhibited a forgiving turn of mind by asking to see her. Left by herself in the smoking room, she suddenly heard a bark in the passage which had a familiar sound in her ears. She opened the door, and in rushed Tommy with one of his shrieks of delight. Curiosity had taken him into the house. He had heard the voices in the smoking room, had recognized Isabel's voice, and had waited with his customary cunning and his customary distrust of strangers until Hardyman was out of the way. Isabel kissed and caressed him, and then drove him out again to the lawn, fearing that Lady Lydiard might return to look for him. Going back to the smoking room, she stood at the window watching for Hardyman's return. When the servants came to look for the dog, she could only tell them that she had last seen him in the grounds, not far from the cottage. The useless search being abandoned, and the carriage having left the gate, who should crawl out from the back of a cupboard in which some empty hampers were placed but Tommy himself? How he had contrived to get back to the smoking room, unless she had omitted to completely close the door on her return, it was impossible to say. But there he was, determined this time to stay with Isabel, and keeping in his hiding-place until he heard the movement of the carriage wheels, which informed him that his lawful mistress had left the cottage. Isabel had at once called Hardyman, on the chance that the carriage might yet be stopped. It was already out of sight, and nobody knew which of 2 roads it had taken, both leading to London. In this emergency, Isabel could only look at Hardyman and ask what was to be done. "I can't spare a servant till after the party," he answered. "The dog must be tied up in the stables." Isabel shook her head. Tommy was not accustomed to be tied up. He would make a disturbance, and he would be beaten by the grooms. "I will take care of him," she said. "He won't leave me." "There's something else to think of besides the dog," Hardyman rejoined irritably. "Look at these letters." He pulled them out of his pocket as he spoke. "Here are no less than 7 men, all calling themselves my friends, who accepted my invitation, and who write to excuse themselves on the very day of the party. Do you know why? They're all afraid of my father. I forgot to tell you he's a cabinet minister as well as a lord. Cowards and cads. They have heard he isn't coming, and they think to curry favour with the great man by stopping away. Come along, Isabel. Let's take their names off the luncheon table. Not a man of them shall ever darken my doors again." "I am to blame for what has happened," Isabel answered sadly. "I am estranging you from your friends. There is still time, Alfred, to alter your mind and let me go." He put his arm around her with rough fondness. "I would sacrifice every friend I have in the world rather than lose you. Come along." They left the cottage. At the entrance to the tent, Hardyman noticed the dog at Isabel's heels, and vented his ill temper, as usual with male humanity, on the nearest unoffending creature that he could find. "Be off, you mongrel brute!" he shouted. The tail of Tommy relaxed from its customary tight curve over the small of his back, and the legs of Tommy, with his tail between them, took him at full gallop to the friendly shelter of the cupboard in the smoking room. It was one of those trifling circumstances which women notice seriously. Isabel said nothing. She only thought to herself, "I wish he had shown his temper when I first knew him." They entered the tent. "I'll read the names," said Hardyman, "and you find the cards and tear them up." "Stop! I'll keep the cards. You're just the sort of woman my father likes. He'll be reconciled to me when he sees you, after we are married. If one of those men ever asks him for a place, I'll take care, if it's years hence, to put an obstacle in his way. Here, take my pencil and make a mark on the card to remind me, the same mark I set against a horse in my book when I don't like him. A cross, enclosed with a circle." He produced his pocket-book. His hands trembled with anger as he gave the pencil to Isabel, and laid the book on the table. He had just read the name of the first false friend, and Isabel had just found the card, when a servant appeared with a message. "Mrs. Drumblade has arrived, sir, and wishes to see you on a matter of the greatest importance." Hardyman left the tent, not very willingly. "Wait here," he said to Isabel. "I'll be back directly." She was standing near her own place at the table. Moody had left one end of the jeweller's case visible above the napkin to attract her attention. In a minute more the bracelet and note were in her hands. She dropped on her chair, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions that rose in her at the sight of the bracelet, at the reading of the note. Her head drooped and the tears filled her eyes. Are all women as blind as I have been to what is good and noble in the men who love them? She wondered sadly. Better as it is, she thought, with a bitter sigh. I am not worthy of him." As she took up the pencil to write her answer to Moody on the back of her dinner card, the servant appeared again at the door of the tent. "My master wants you at the cottage, miss, immediately." Isabel rose, putting the bracelet and the note in the silver-mounted leather pocket, a present from Hardyman, which hung at her belt. In the hurry of passing round the table to get out, she never noticed that her dress touched Hardyman's pocketbook, placed close to the edge, and threw it down on the grass below. The book fell into one of the heated cracks which Lady Lydiard had noticed as evidence of the neglected condition of the cottage lawn. "You ought to hear the pleasant news my sister has just brought me," said Hardyman when Isabel joined him in the parlour. "Mrs. Drumblade has been told, on the best authority, that my mother is not coming to the party." "There must be some reason, of course, dear Isabel," added Mrs. Drumblade. "Have you any idea of what it can be?" "I haven't seen my mother myself, and all my inquiries have failed to find it out." She looked searchingly at Isabel as she spoke. The mask of sympathy on her face was admirably worn. Nobody who possessed only a superficial acquaintance with Mrs. Drumblade's character would have suspected how thoroughly she was enjoying, in secret, the position of embarrassment in which her news had placed her brother. Instinctively doubting whether Mrs. Drumblade's friendly behaviour was quite as sincere as it appeared to be, Isabel answered that she was a stranger to Lady Rotherfield, and was therefore quite at a loss to explain the cause of her ladyship's absence. As she spoke, the guests began to arrive in quick succession, and the subject was dropped as a matter of course. It was not a merry party. Hardyman's approaching marriage had been made the topic of much malicious gossip, and Isabel's character had, as usual in such cases, become the object of all the false reports that scandal could invent. Lady Rotherfield's absence confirmed the general conviction that Hardyman was disgracing himself. The men were all more or less uneasy. The women resented the discovery that Isabel was, personally speaking at least, beyond the reach of hostile criticism. Her beauty was viewed as a downright offence. Her refined and modest manners were set down as perfect acting. Really disgusting, my dear, in so young a girl. General Drumblade, a large and mouldy veteran, in a state of chronic astonishment, after his own matrimonial experience at Hardyman's folly in marrying at all, diffused a wide circle of gloom wherever he went and whatever he did. His accomplished wife, forcing her high spirits on everybody's attention with a sort of kittenish playfulness, intensified the depressing effect of the general dullness by all the force of the strongest contrast. After waiting half an hour for his mother, and waiting in vain, Hardyman led the way to the tent in despair. "The sooner I fill their stomachs and get rid of them," he thought savagely, "the better I shall be pleased." The luncheon was attacked by the company with a certain silent ferocity which the waiters noticed as remarkable, even in their large experience. The men drank deeply, but with wonderfully little effect in raising their spirits. The women, with the exception of amiable Mrs. Drumblade, kept Isabel deliberately out of the conversation that went on among them. General Drumblade, sitting next to her in one of the places of honour, discoursed to Isabel privately on my brother-in-law Hardyman's infernal temper. A young marquise on her other side, a mere lad, chosen to make the necessary speech in acknowledgment of his superior rank, rose in a state of nervous trepidation to propose Isabel's health as the chosen bride of their host. Pale and trembling, conscious of having forgotten the words which he had learnt beforehand, this unhappy young nobleman began. "Ladies and gentlemen, I haven't an idea—" He stopped, put his hand to his head, stared wildly, and sat down again, having contrived to state his own case with masterly brevity and perfect truth in a speech of 7 words. While the dismay in some cases and the amusement in others was still at its height, Hardyman's valet made his appearance, and, approaching his master, said in a whisper, "Could I speak to you? Sit for a moment outside." "What the devil do you want?" Hardyman asked irritably. "Is that a letter in your hand? Give it to me." The valet was a Frenchman. In other words, he had a sense of what was due to himself. His master had forgotten this. He gave up the letter with a certain dignity of manner, and left the tent. Hardyman opened the letter. He turned pale as he read it, crumpled it in his hand, and threw it down on the table. "By God, it's a lie!" he exclaimed furiously. The guests rose in confusion. Mrs. Drumblade, finding the letter within her reach, coolly possessed herself of it, recognized her mother's handwriting, and read these lines: "I have only now succeeded in persuading your father to let me write to you. For God's sake, break off your marriage at any sacrifice. Your father has heard on unanswerable authority that Miss Isabel Miller left her situation in Lady Lydiard's house on suspicion of theft." While his sister was reading this letter, Hardyman had made his way to Isabel's chair. "I must speak to you directly," he whispered. "Come away with me." He turned as he took her arm and looked at the table. "Where is my letter?" he asked. Mrs. Drumblade handed it to him, dexterously crumpled up again as she had found it. "No bad news, dear Alfred, I hope," she said in her most affectionate manner. Hardyman snatched the letter from her without answering, and led Isabel out of the tent. "Read that," he said, when they were alone, "and tell me at once whether it's true or false." Isabel read the letter. For a moment the shock of the discovery held her speechless. She recovered herself and returned the letter. "It is true," she answered. Hardyman staggered back as if she had shot him. "True that you are guilty?" he asked. "No, I am innocent. Everybody who knows me believes in my innocence. It is true the appearances were against me. They are against me still." Having said this, she waited quietly and firmly for his next words. He passed his hand over his forehead with a sigh of relief. "It's bad enough as it is," he said, speaking quietly on his side. "But the remedy for it is plain enough. Come back to the tent." She never moved. "Why?" she asked. "Do you suppose I don't believe in your innocence too?" he answered. "The one way of setting you right with the world now is for me to make you my wife in spite of the appearances that point to you. I'm too fond of you, Isabel, to give you up. Come back with me, and I will announce our marriage to my friends." She took his hand and kissed it. "It is generous and good of you," she said, "but it must not be." He took a step nearer to her. "What do you mean?" he asked. "It was against my will," she pursued, "that my aunt concealed the truth from you. I did wrong to consent to it. I will do wrong no more. Your mother is right, Alfred. After what has happened, I am not fit to be your wife until my innocence is proved. It is not proved yet." The angry color began to rise in his face once more. "Take care," he said. "I am not in a humor to be trifled with." "I am not trifling with you," she answered in low, sad tones. "You really mean what you say?" "I mean it. Don't be obstinate, Isabel. Take time to consider." "You're very kind, Alfred. My duty is plain to me. I will marry you, if you still wish it, when my good name is restored to me, not before." He laid one hand on her arm and pointed with the other to the guests in the distance, all leaving the tent on the way to their carriages. "Your good name will be restored to you," he said, "on the day when I make you my wife. The worst enemy you have cannot associate my name with a suspicion of theft. Remember that, and think a little before you decide. You see those people there? If you don't change your mind by the time they have got to the cottage, it's good-bye between us, and good-bye forever. I refuse to wait for you. I refuse to accept a conditional engagement. Wait and think. They're walking slowly. You have got some minutes more." He still held her arm, watching the guests as they gradually receded from view. It was not until they had all collected in a group outside the cottage door that he spoke himself, or that he permitted Isabel to speak again. "Now," he said, "you have had your time to get cool. Will you take my arm and join those people with me, or will you say good-bye forever?" "Forgive me, Alfred," she began gently. "I cannot consent, in justice to you, to shelter myself behind your name. It is the name of your family, and they have a right to expect that you will not degrade it." "I want a plain answer," he interposed sternly. "Which is it, yes or no?" She looked at him with sad, compassionate eyes. Her voice was firm as she answered him in one word as he had desired. The word was, "No." Without speaking to her, without even looking at her, he turned and walked back to the cottage. Making his way silently through the group of visitors, every one of whom had been informed of what had happened by his sister, with his head down and his lips fast closed, he entered the parlor and rang the bell which communicated with his foreman's rooms at the stables. "You know that I am going abroad on business," he said when the man appeared. "Yes, sir. I am going to-day. Going by the night train to Dover. Order the horse to be put to instantly in the dog-cart. Is there anything wanted before I am off?" The inexorable necessities of business asserted their claims through the obedient medium of the foreman. Chafing at the delay, Hardyman was obliged to sit at his desk, signing cheques and passing accounts, with the dog-cart waiting in the stable-yard. A knock at the door startled him in the middle of his work. "Come in," he called out sharply. He looked up, expecting to see one of the guests or one of the servants. It was Moody who entered the room. Hardyman laid down his pen and fixed his eyes sternly on the man who had dared to interrupt him. "What the devil do you want?" he asked. "I have seen Miss Isabel and spoken with her," Moody replied. "Mr. Hardyman, I believe it is in your power to set this matter right. For the young lady's sake, sir, you must not leave England without doing it." Hardyman turned to his foreman. "Is this fellow mad or drunk?" he asked. Moody proceeded as calmly and as resolutely as if those words had not been spoken. "I apologize for my intrusion, sir. I will trouble you with no explanations. I will only ask one question. Have you a memorandum of the number of that £500 note you paid away in France?" Hardyman lost all control over himself. "You scoundrel!" he cried. "Have you been prying into my private affairs? Is it your business to know what I did in France?" "Is it your vengeance on a woman to refuse to tell her the number of a banknote?" Moody rejoined firmly. That answer forced its way through Hardyman's anger to Hardyman's sense of honor. He rose and advanced to Moody. For a moment the two men faced each other in silence. "You're a bold fellow," said Hardyman, with a sudden change from anger to irony. "I'll do the lady justice. I'll look at my pocket-book." He put his hand into the breast pocket of his coat. He searched his other pockets. He turned over the objects on his writing-table. The book was gone. Moody watched him with a feeling of despair. "Oh, Mr. Hardyman, don't say you've lost your pocket-book." He sat down again at his desk with sullen submission to the new disaster. "All I can say is you are at liberty to look for it," he replied. "I must have dropped it somewhere." He turned impatiently to the foreman. "Now then, what is the next cheque wanted? I shall go mad if I wait in this damned place much longer." Moody left him and found his way to the servants' offices. "Mr. Hardyman has lost his pocket-book," he said. "Look for it indoors and out, on the lawn and in the tent. £10 reward for the man who finds it." Servants and waiters instantly dispersed, eager for the promised reward. The men who pursued the search outside the cottage divided their forces. Some of them examined the lawn and the flower beds, others went straight to the empty tent. These last were too completely absorbed in pursuing the object in view to notice that they disturbed a dog, eating a stolen lunch of his own from the morsels left on the plates. The dog slunk away under the canvas when the men came in, waited in hiding until they had gone, then returned to the tent, and went on with his luncheon. Moody hastened back to the part of the grounds, close to the shrubbery, in which Isabel was waiting his return. She looked at him while he was telling her of his interview with Hardyman with an expression in her eyes which he had never seen in them before, an expression which set his heart beating wildly and made him break off in his narrative before he had reached the end. "I understand," she said quietly, as he stopped in confusion. "You have made one more sacrifice to my welfare. Robert, I believe you are the noblest man that ever breathed the breath of life." His eyes sank before hers. He blushed like a boy. "I have done nothing for you yet," he said. "Don't despair of the future if the pocket-book should not be found. I know who the man is who received the banknote, and I have only to find him to decide the question whether it is the stolen note or not." She smiled sadly at his enthusiasm. "Are you going back to Mr. Sharon to help you?" she asked. "That trick he played on me has destroyed my belief in him. He no more knows than I do who the thief really is." "You are mistaken, Isabel. He knows, and I know." He stopped there, and made a sign to her to be silent. One of the servants was approaching them. "Is the pocket-book found?" Moody asked. "No, sir." "Has Mr. Hardyman left the cottage?" "He has just gone, sir." "Have you any further instructions to give us?" "No. There is my address in London, if the pocket-book should be found." The man took the card that was handed to him and retired. Moody offered his arm to Isabel. "I am at your service," he said, "when you wish to return to your aunt." They had advanced nearly as far as the tent on their way out of the grounds when they were met by a gentleman walking towards them from the cottage. He was a stranger to Isabel. Moody immediately recognized him as Mr. Felix Sweetsir. "Ha! Our good Moody!" cried Felix. "Enviable man, you look younger than ever." He took off his hat to Isabel. His bright, restless eyes suddenly became quiet as they rested on her. "Have I the honor of addressing the future Mrs. Hardyman?" May I offer my best congratulations? What has become of our friend Alfred?" Moody answered for Isabel. "If you will make inquiries at the cottage, sir," he said, "you will find that you are mistaken, to say the least of it, in addressing your questions to this young lady." Felix took off his hat again, with the most becoming appearance of surprise and distress. "Something wrong, I fear?" he said, addressing Isabel. "I am indeed ashamed if I have ignorantly given you a moment's pain. Pray accept my most sincere apologies. I have only this instant arrived. My health would not allow me to be present at the luncheon. Permit me to express the earnest hope that matters may be set right to the satisfaction of all parties. Good afternoon." He bowed with elaborate courtesy, and turned back to the cottage. "Who is that?" Isabel asked. "Lady Lydiard's nephew, Mr. Felix Sweetsir," Moody answered, with a sudden sternness of tone, and a sudden coldness of manner which surprised Isabel. "You don't like him?" she said. As she spoke, Felix stopped to give audience to one of the grooms, who had apparently been sent with a message to him. He turned so that his face was once more visible to Isabel. Moody pressed her hand significantly as it rested on his arm. "Look well at that man," he whispered. "It's time to warn you. Mr. Felix Sweetsir is the worst enemy you have." Isabel heard him in speechless astonishment. He went on in tones that trembled with suppressed emotion. "You doubt if Sharon knows the thief. You doubt if I know the thief. Isabel, as certain as the heaven is above us, there stands the wretch who stole the banknote." She drew her hand out of his arm with a cry of terror. She looked at him as if she doubted whether he was in his right mind. He took her hand and waited a moment, trying to compose himself. "Listen to me," he said. "At the first consultation I had with Sharon, he gave this advice to Mr. Troy, and to me. He said, 'Suspect the very last person on whom suspicion could possibly fall.' Those words, taken with the questions he had asked before he pronounced his opinion, struck through me as if he had struck me with a knife. I instantly suspected Lady Lydiard's nephew. Wait! From that time to this, I have said nothing of my suspicion to any living soul. I knew in my own heart that it took its rise in the inveterate dislike that I have always felt for Mr. Sweetsir, and I distrusted it accordingly. But I went back to Sharon for all that, and put the case into his hands. His investigations informed me that Mr. Sweetsir owed debts of honor, as gentlemen call them, incurred through lost bets, to a large number of persons, and among them a bet of £500 lost to Mr. Hardyman. Further inquiries showed that Mr. Hardyman had taken the lead in declaring that he would post Mr. Sweetsir as a defaulter, and have him turned out of his clubs and turned out of the betting ring. Ruin stared him in the face if he failed to pay his debt to Mr. Hardyman on the last day left to him, the day after the note was lost. On that very morning, Lady Lydiard, speaking to me of her nephew's visit to her, said, 'If I had given him an opportunity of speaking, Felix would have borrowed money of me.' I saw it in his face. One moment more, Isabel. I am not only certain that Mr. Sweetsir took the £500 note out of the open letter, I am firmly persuaded that he is the man who told Lord Rutherfield of the circumstances under which you left Lady Lydiard's house. Your marriage to Mr. Hardyman might have put you in a position to detect the theft. You, not I, might in that case have discovered from your husband that the stolen note was the note with which Mr. Sweetsir paid his debt. He came here, you may depend on it, to make sure that he had succeeded in destroying your prospects. A more depraved villain at heart than that man never swung from a gallows." He checked himself at those words. The shock of the disclosure, the passion and vehemence with which he spoke, overwhelmed Isabel. She trembled like a frightened child. While he was still trying to soothe and reassure her, a low whining made itself heard at her feet. They looked down and saw Tommy. Finding himself noticed at last, he expressed his sense of relief by a bark. Something dropped out of his mouth. As Moody stooped to pick it up, the dog ran to Isabel and pushed his head against her feet, as his way was when he expected to have the handkerchief thrown over him, preparatory to one of those games at hide-and-seek which have been already mentioned. Isabel put out her hand to caress him, when she was stopped by a cry from Moody. It was his turn to tremble now. His voice faltered as he said the words, "The dog has found the pocket-book." He opened the book with shaking hands. A betting book was bound up in it with the customary calendar. He turned to the date of the day after the robbery. There was the entry: Felix Sweetser paid £500. Note number N8,70564. Dated 15th May, 1875. Moody took from his waistcoat pocket his own memorandum of the number of the lost bank note. "Read it, Isabel," he said. "I won't trust my memory." She read it. The number and date of the note entered in the pocket-book exactly corresponded with the number and date of the note that Lady Lydiard had placed in her letter. Moody handed the pocket-book to Isabel. "There is the proof of your innocence," he said. "Thanks to the dog!" "Will you write and tell Mr. Hardyman what has happened?" he asked, with his head down and his eyes on the ground. She answered him with the bright color suddenly flowing over her face. "You shall write to him," she said, "when the time comes." "What time?" he asked. She threw her arms around his neck and hid her face on his bosom. "The time," she whispered, "when I am your wife." A low growl from Tommy reminded them that he, too, had some claim to be noticed. Isabel dropped on her knees and saluted her old playfellow with the heartiest kisses she had ever given him since the day when their acquaintance began. "You darling!" she said, as she put him down again. "What can I do to reward you?" Tommy rolled over on his back, more slowly than usual in consequence of his luncheon in the tent. He elevated his four paws in the air and looked lazily at Isabel out of his bright brown eyes. If ever a dog's look spoke yet, Tommy's look said, "I have eaten too much. Rub my stomach." End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 Of My Lady's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 22. Postscript. Persons of a speculative turn of mind are informed that the following document is for sale, and are requested to mention what sum they will give for it. I owe you, Lady Lydiard, £500.
Felix.
Switzer. Her ladyship became possessed of this pecuniary remittance under circumstances which surround it with a halo of romantic interest. It was the last communication she was destined to receive from her accomplished nephew. There was a note attached to it which cannot fail to enhance its value in the estimation of all right-minded persons who assist the circulation of paper money. The lines that follow are strictly confidential. Note: Our excellent Moody informs me, my dear aunt, that you have decided against his advice on refusing to prosecute. I have not the slightest idea of what he means, but I am very much obliged to him, nevertheless, for reminding me of a circumstance which is of some interest to yourself personally. I am on the point of retiring to the Continent in search of health. One generally forgets something important when one starts on a journey. Before Moody called, I had entirely forgotten to mention that I had the pleasure of borrowing £500 of you some little time since. On the occasion to which I refer, your language and manner suggested that you would not lend me the money if I asked for it. Obviously, the only course left was to take it without asking. I took it while Moody was gone to get some curacoa, and I returned to the picture gallery in time to receive that delicious liquor from the footman's hands. You will naturally ask why I found it necessary to supply myself, if I may borrow an expression from the language of state finance, with this forced loan. I was actuated by motives which I think do me honor. My position at the time was critical in the extreme. My credit with the money lenders was at an end. My friends had all turned their backs on me. I must either take the money or disgrace my family. If there is a man living who is sincerely attached to his family, I am that man. I took the money. Conceive your position as my aunt. I say nothing of myself. If I had adopted the other alternative, turned out of the Jockey Club, turned out of Tattersall's, turned out of the betting ring, in short, posted publicly as a defaulter before the noblest institution in England, the turf, and all for want of £500 to stop the mouth of the greatest brute I know of, Alfred Hardyman. Let me not harrow your feelings and mine by dwelling on it. Dear and admirable woman, to you belongs the honor of saving the credit of the family. I can claim nothing but the inferior merit of having offered you the opportunity. My IOU, it is needless to say, can I do anything for you abroad? F.S. To this it is only necessary to add first that Moody was perfectly right in believing F.S. to be the person who informed Hardyman's father of Isabel's position when she left Lady Lydiard's house, and secondly, that Felix did really forward Mr. Troy's narrative of the theft to the French police, altering nothing in it but the number of the lost bank note. What is there left to write about? Nothing is left but to say good-bye, very sorrowfully on the writer's part, to the persons of the story. Good-bye to Miss Pink, who will regret to her dying day that Isabel's answer to Hardyman was no. Good-bye to Lady Lydiard, who differs with Miss Pink, and would have regretted it to her dying day if the answer had been yes. Good-bye to Moody and Isabel, whose history has closed with the closing of the clergyman's book on their wedding day. Good-bye to Hardyman, who has sold his farm and his horses, and has begun a new life among the famous fast trotters of America. Good-bye to old Sharon, who, a martyr to his promise, brushed his hair and washed his face in honor of Moody's marriage, and catching a severe cold as the necessary consequence, declared in the intervals of sneezing that he would never do it again. And last, not least, good-bye to Tommy? No, the writer gave Tommy his dinner not half an hour since, and is too fond of him to say good-bye. End of chapter 22. End of My Lady's Money by Wilkie Collins.